Welcome to Contradicting the Cosmos, the show where I refute the YouTube atheist, the Cosmic Skeptic. In today's episode, Mr. Cosmic is going to attempt to try and argue that evil cannot be the result of free will. Let's begin.
Now, the specific objection to this supposed problem that I want to take a look at is the argument that evil exists in the world because God gave humans free will. And this is a popular response. People will tell you that, yes, God wants people to get into heaven and he wants them to be good, but he values free will even more, and so he permits evil as a natural result of allowing humans to have free will.
The atheist assumes that if God is all-powerful, he can create just any world that he wants. And that's not necessarily true. If God wills to create free creatures, then he can't guarantee they'll always do what is right. It's logically impossible to make someone freely do something. So God's being all-powerful doesn't mean he can do the logically impossible.
But if you employ this line of thinking, then you run into two immediate problems, the first of which being this. Evil is generally categorized into two forms. We have moral evil and natural evil. Now, moral evil is dependent on free will. People have to make a choice to do things like murder, stealing, or rape. But on the other hand, you have natural evil, things like earthquakes, famines, and floods, and these things can't be attributable to free will, so you'd have to still explain where this evil comes from.
It actually can be attributable to free will, just not necessarily an individual's free will. A nation's free will, perhaps. God does judge nations, but it is very difficult to tell the difference between God's judgment and just another tornado sweeping through Tornado Alley. So unless God specifically says otherwise, it's probably best to just not assume it's God's judgment on any particular thing. But every natural disaster can be attributable to the free will of Adam. When Adam chose to sin, he was responsible for the entire universe. There's a particular word or phrase for that, I forget what it is. When Adam sinned, he was representing the whole universe, including all his descendants. He was acting as our representative, whether he consciously chose to or not, which is why we are all born into his sin. We are all born sinners. It is also why the earth was cursed for his sake. So all natural evil is a result of Adam's sin, which he freely chose to commit.
And the second, and in my opinion more compelling problem that I can come up with, is this. Consider the following question. Can consciously imposed evil and suffering exist in heaven? Now, this might seem like a yes or no question, in other words, a dilemma, but I would argue that it's actually a trilemma. I think that there are three possible answers to this question. And the first is yes, consciously imposed evil and suffering can exist in heaven. But of course this makes no sense, because if one conscious being can impose evil and suffering upon another, then it wouldn't really be heaven at all. So we can immediately rule this one out. Option 2 is no, because God removes this part of free will from human ability. In other words, he disallows people from committing evil acts. But if this is true, then that means that as soon as you get to heaven, your free will is immediately restricted. You are no longer a free-thinking individual. And again, would you really consider it to be heaven if you're some kind of robot programmed to only be able to do good deeds with no freedom? Think of it this way. Under these circumstances, your free will does not exist in heaven. You can't commit consciously evil acts. But contrast this with hell, where you'd have no reason to, but there's nothing stopping you from being nice. You could say thank you as Satan throws you into a blazing fire. And this naturally lends itself to the conclusion that the only place that has true free will, the only place in the afterlife that is truly free, is hell. And of course this also isn't a very satisfactory answer, and that leaves us with our only remaining possible answer, which is no, this type of evil can't exist in heaven, but free will is somehow still retained, perhaps through some kind of theological magic. Of course, the problem with this line of thought is that it completely defeats the original objection. If you're arguing that there can exist a place, i.e. heaven, where there is both free will and no evil, then the argument that evil only exists as a result of free will doesn't make any sense. So I'm afraid that whichever answer you come up with to this trilemma, it doesn't lead to a satisfactory conclusion.
First, let's cover that second answer. I would mostly agree with Cosmic Skeptic on this one, except for a couple small points. First, Satan would not throw you into the lake of fire. He is not in charge of you in hell. Satan is a prisoner himself, and he actually has his own separate prison. And two, it's debatable whether you actually do have free will in hell. After all, what use does anybody have with free will in hell? But like I said, that's a minor point. And the other two answers I'll probably have to combine for this. But the answer is yes, free will exists in heaven. And yes, the possibility of evil exists in heaven. But no, you will not commit evil in heaven. That's what earth is for. We spend our time on earth getting experience with evil and growing a distaste for it. To put it simply, the people who hate evil and will not commit evil in heaven will go to heaven. And those who like evil and would do evil in heaven will not go there. Now, of course, that is a very simplified answer, because it brings up the question, are you good because God chose you, or did God choose you because you would be good? And that's way more complicated than I'm prepared to go into right now.
Now, of course, despite all of this, I'm not saying by any stretch that the problem of evil is a perfect objection to the existence of God. There are plenty of rebuttals that you could come up with as a theist. Like I mentioned earlier, you could simply say that evil exists as God's form of revenge, like Noah's Ark or Sodom and Gomorrah. Of course, then you do run into a whole bunch of problems. For instance, how is it that unborn children are dying when there are people who blatantly contradict religious teachings who don't seem to suffer in any way at all?
If you want the answer to that, just read the book of Job. I would say study the book of Job, but we've seen how Mr. Cosmic studies his Bible. Anyway, God works all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. To do this, he may prolong judgment or judge quickly, depending on the circumstances, and every subsequent circumstance that decision affects.